It remains the only injury in sports history graphic enough to cause 11 fans to faint and 2 to suffer heart attacks right in the stands. On live television, Clint Malarchuk's throat was slashed open, turning a hockey rink into a scene from a slasher film. He survived only because a former combat medic plunged his fingers directly into the wound to pinch the artery shut. But the blade didn't kill him, and 19 years later, neither did the bullet. This is the story of a man who survived a gruesome public execution, only to try and finish the job himself with a rifle. He is a walking medical anomaly, a man living with a scar across his throat and a lead bullet permanently lodged in his skull. But Clint Malarchuk didn't just become indestructible on that night in 1989. He was forged in the cold, long before the blade ever touched his skin. Grande Prairie, Alberta, 1961. A place where the thermometer frequently dips to 40 below zero. In these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes brittle. The world is hostile by default. This is where Clint entered the world. There is a theory in psychology called the survivor's guilt. But before that, there is simply the survivor's instinct. In the Canadian wilderness, you learn very quickly that pain is not a signal to stop. Pain is just information. His father, Mike Malarchuk, was a man of his time, tough, distant, hardened by the cold. He put Clint on skates almost as soon as the boy could walk. But this wasn't just play, it was an indoctrination. Hockey in its essence is a beautiful violence, but for a goalkeeper, it is a psychological aberration. The job description itself is a psychological aberration. Every other player on the ice is moving, attacking, fleeing, creating. The goalkeeper, he waits. He stands in a small painted cage, waiting for a hard rubber projectile to be fired at him at speeds that can shatter bone. His job is not to create. His job is to deny the goal, to deny the failure, to deny the pain. Neurologists suggest that the brain of an elite goalkeeper functions differently. It must suppress the natural human instinct to flinch. When a rock flies at your face, 99% of human evolution screams, "Turn away, protect the eyes." The goalkeeper must override millions of years of evolution. He must keep his eyes open. He must move into the path of the danger. Clint Malarchuk learned this lesson on the frozen ponds of Edmonton. But he learned something else too, something darker. He learned that his worth as a human being was directly tied to that zero on the scoreboard. If the puck went in, he wasn't just a goalie who missed a save, he was a failure, a disgrace. This wasn't just competitiveness, this was the early creeping vine of obsessive-compulsive disorder, wrapping itself around his brainstem. Before he even reached puberty, the rituals began. The tapping of the pads, the specific way he tied his skates, the intrusive thoughts that whispered, "If you don't touch that goalpost 3 times, your mom will get sick. If you don't step onto the ice with your left foot, you will die." You see, the horror didn't start with the skate blade in Buffalo. It started here, in the silence of his own mind. The anxiety was a pressure cooker, building up steam year after year, save after save. He was a cowboy. Yes, he rode horses, he wore the hat, he played with a reckless, frantic style that fans loved. But a cowboy is often a tragic figure, a man who rides alone, hiding his fear under a brim, waiting for the bullet that has his name on it. And for Clint, that bullet was taking a long, circuitous route. It would take decades to arrive. But first, he had to meet the blade. Fate is often disguised as opportunity. For Clint Malarchuk, the road to the slaughterhouse began with a phone call that he initially thought was the best news of his life. It was early March 1989, and he was playing for the Washington Capitals. He was doing well, but he was restless. Then came the trade. He was being sent to the Buffalo Sabres. For a hockey player, being traded is usually a moment of upheaval, a dislocation. But for Clint, Buffalo felt like destiny. It was a blue-collar town, a Rust Belt city filled with hard-working people who appreciated grit over glamour. It was a perfect fit for a cowboy goalie. He arrived in the city with a sense of renewal. The fans in Buffalo embraced him immediately. They loved his aggressive style, his willingness to roam out of the net, his cowboy hat, and his unfiltered personality. For a brief shining moment, the anxiety that had dogged him since childhood seemed to recede. The rituals were still there, the tapping, the lacing, but they felt manageable. He was the starting goaltender for a contending team. He was 27 years old. He felt invincible. The arena where the Sabres played, the Buffalo Memorial Auditorium, affectionately known as the Aud, was a relic of a bygone era. It wasn't one of the sterile corporate glass palaces we see today. It was a fortress of concrete and steel. The seats were pitched steeply, creating a wall of humanity that seemed to hang right over the ice. When the crowd roared in the Aud, the noise didn't just vibrate in your ears, it rattled your bones. It was an intimate, intense, and dangerous place to play. March 22nd, 1989, a Wednesday. If you believe in omens, you might look back at that day and find them. But the terrifying truth of tragedy is its banality. The sun rose just like any other day. Clint woke up feeling good. He went through his morning routine. He ate his pregame meal, steak and pasta, the fuel of champions. He drove to the arena, listening to country music, his mind focused on the task at hand, shutting down the St. Louis Blues. Inside the locker room, the atmosphere was loose. The Sabres were playing well. There was tape being wrapped around sticks, skates being sharpened, jokes being traded. Clint sat in his stall, retreating into his own world as game time approached. He began the process of armoring himself. First the underlayers, then the heavy chest protector, the leg pads that weighed as much as car tires, the glove, the blocker, and finally the mask. When he pulled that fiberglass cage over his face that night, he had no idea he was dressing for his own execution. He skated out onto the ice for warm-ups. The Aud was buzzing. 16,000 fans were filtering in. The ice was brilliant white, a pristine sheet of frozen water waiting to be scarred by steel. Clint went through his rituals. Tap the left post, tap the right post, tap the crossbar. He checked the angles. He stretched his groin. He felt fast. He felt sharp. In the opposing warm-up zone, the St. Louis Blues were doing the same. Among them was a player named Steve Tuttle, a 23-year-old right-winger. Tuttle was just another guy in a jersey, a generic opponent. Clint didn't know him. He had no reason to fear him. In the cosmic script of that night, Steve Tuttle was not a villain. He was merely a variable in a physics equation that was about to go horribly wrong. The game began. The puck dropped. The noise of the crowd swelled into that familiar, comforting roar. For the first few minutes, it was textbook hockey. Back and forth, dump and chase. Clint made a few routine saves, feeling the puck hit his pads with a satisfying thud. The rhythm of the game settled in. But there is a phenomenon in aviation disasters called the Swiss cheese model. It suggests that a catastrophe rarely happens due to one single failure. It happens when multiple unrelated layers of defense coincidentally align their holes, allowing a trajectory of doom to pass through unchecked. On March 22nd, the holes were aligning. Clint played a stand-up style, holding his head high to see over the traffic, leaving his throat exposed. In 1989, goaltender neck guards were not mandatory. They were considered uncomfortable, hot, and restrictive. Clint, like most goalies of his era, played with his neck completely exposed. There was a 6-inch strip of vulnerable flesh between the bottom of his mask and the top of his chest protector. And finally, the matchup itself was conspiring against him. Uwe Krupp, the Sabres defenseman, was a giant, 6'6". Steve Tuttle was charging hard. Their collision course was set. The clock ticked down. 16 minutes, 15 minutes and 50 seconds, 15 minutes and 43 seconds. Clint stood in his crease, crouched slightly, his stick on the ice. He was watching the play develop near the blue line. He saw Tuttle catch a pass. He saw Krupp step up to check him. It was a standard play. He had seen it 1,000 times. He prepared himself for a shot. He did not prepare for a blade. It is haunting to look at photos of Clint from that first period. He looks so focused, so alive. He is completely unaware that he is staring down the barrel of a shotgun. The premonition wasn't in his mind. It was in the geometry of the players rushing toward him. The universe held its breath. The noise of the crowd seemed to hang in suspension. We often wonder if victims of trauma sense it coming. Does the hair on the back of their neck stand up? Does the air get colder? Clint Malarchuk says no. He felt nothing but the anticipation of the next save. He was a professional doing his job, secure in his armor, protected by the rules of the game. But rules are just ink on paper, and physics does not read the rule book. As Steve Tuttle and Uwe Krupp crossed the threshold of the face-off circle, their skates tangled. The stability of the world collapsed. Gravity took over, and the Cowboy Goalie, the man who had fought so hard to escape the frozen wasteland of his childhood, was about to be plunged into a red-hot hell. The premonition ended. The horror began. Time is a deceptive construct. We perceive it as a constant river, flowing at a steady, unchangeable speed. But anyone who has ever been in a car accident, a fist fight, or a life-threatening catastrophe knows the truth. Time is elastic. It can stretch. It can compress. And in moments of extreme trauma, it can stop altogether. For the 16,000 people inside the Buffalo Memorial Auditorium on March 22nd, 1989, the universe condensed itself into a single frozen fraction of a second. The clock read 15:43 remaining in the first period, but for Clint Malarchuk, the clock had ceased to exist. We are witnessing a collision of mass, velocity, and sharp steel. Uwe Krupp, the Sabres defenseman, stood 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed over 230 pounds. He was a behemoth on skates. Steve Tuttle, the charging winger for the St. Louis Blues, was smaller but moving with the kinetic energy of a missile. They were hurtling toward the goal crease at a combined speed of nearly 40 miles per hour. When two bodies of that mass collide on a low-friction surface like ice, the result is chaos. There is no traction to stop the slide. There is only momentum. As they crashed into each other just outside the goal crease, the laws of gravity took over. Krupp, the larger man, fell forward, his weight driving Tuttle down toward the ice. But Tuttle didn't just crumple. His momentum carried him forward, feet first. In a desperate, reflexive attempt to regain his balance, or perhaps simply because his body was being torqued by the impact, Tuttle's legs kicked upward. An ice hockey skate is a marvel of engineering designed for speed and agility. But stripped of its sporting context, it is a 12-inch blade of tempered carbon steel. It is hollow ground, meaning the bottom is concave, creating two razor-sharp edges that bite into the ice. Players keep these edges honed to a surgical precision. A well-sharpened skate can slice through leather, canvas, and, as history has shown, human bone. As Tuttle's leg swung into the air, that blade ceased to be a piece of sporting equipment. It became a guillotine. Clint Malarchuk was in the butterfly position, knees down, pads spread wide, chest up. He was doing exactly what he had been trained to do for 20 years. He was tracking the puck. He saw the collision coming, but in the chaotic blur of bodies, his brain could not calculate the trajectory of the rogue leg. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn away. He held his ground. The blade approached him from the right side. It moved with the speed of a switchblade snapping open. It bypassed the hard plastic of his chest protector. It bypassed the heavy fiberglass of his mask. It found the one solitary vulnerability in his armor, the 6-inch gap of exposed skin between his jaw and his collarbone. The contact was not a heavy blow. It wasn't a bone-shattering impact that knocks the wind out of you. It was silent. It was precise. The tip of Tuttle's skate hooked under the chin of Clint's mask and dragged across the right side of his neck. In interviews years later, Clint would describe the sensation with chilling specificity. He didn't feel a cut. The nerves in the skin were severed so quickly that they didn't have time to register the sharp pain of a laceration. Instead, he felt a kick to the throat, a dull thud, followed instantly by a sensation of intense heat. It felt as though someone had taken a thick red-hot wire and pulled it violently across his neck. For a microsecond, Clint thought the skate had just unbuckled his mask. He dropped his stick. He reached up with both hands, his heavy blocker and glove still on, to clutch at his throat. He shook his head, a reflexive gesture of denial. He was still on his knees. The crowd was still cheering, their eyes following the puck, unaware that the game had fundamentally changed. The referee was still looking for a penalty, but gravity is relentless. The skate blade had done its work. It had sliced through the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the thick band of muscle that allows you to turn your head. It had severed the jugular vein, the vessel that drains blood from the brain. But cruelly, it had gone deeper. It had nicked the carotid artery, the high-pressure pipeline, carrying oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the brain. The seal was broken. The closed system of the human body was now open to the air. The physics of the collision were over. The biology of death was about to begin. And as Clint Malarchuk kneeled there on the ice, confused by the burning heat in his neck, the pressure inside his circulatory system was building up behind the open wound, preparing to unleash a horror that would stain the memories of an entire generation. The realization of catastrophe usually comes with a sound, a scream, a crash. But on the ice in Buffalo, the horror announced itself with a color. As Clint pulled his hands away from his neck to see what had happened, the dam broke. The pressure of his beating heart, working at the elevated rate of a professional athlete in the middle of a game, forced the blood out of the severed carotid artery with explosive power. It sprayed. A thick, vibrant, crimson arc of blood shot out from the side of his neck. It traveled 6 feet across the ice, splashing against the white surface like paint thrown from a bucket. This is the moment the broadcast footage becomes the stuff of nightmares. The visual is so stark, so impossible to process, that the brain initially rejects it. Blood in movies is often dark, thick, and slow, but arterial blood is different. It is bright red, super oxygenated and lively. It moves with a terrifying vitality, and it has a rhythm. Psht, psht, psht. With every beat of Clint Malarchuk's heart, a new fountain of blood erupted from his neck. He was literally pumping his life out onto the frozen water. The ice around him, pristine and white just seconds ago, was instantly transformed into a gruesome abstract painting. The contrast was sickening. The blinding white of the rink and the deep, shocking red of the blood. The reaction in the arena was a cascading wave of trauma. It started in the front row. The fans sitting behind the glass just feet away from the goal crease saw the spray hit the ice. They saw the steam rising from the warm blood as it hit the cold surface. A woman screamed, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the ambient noise of the game. Then silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that spread outward from the goal like a shockwave. People stopped cheering. They stopped eating. They stood up, hands covering their mouths, eyes wide with a primal disbelief. This wasn't a sports injury. This was a slaughter. In the broadcast booth, the commentators fell silent. They were seasoned professionals who had seen broken legs, concussions, and fights, but they had never seen a man exsanguinating on live television. The cameras zoomed in, then quickly zoomed out, the operators realizing they were capturing a man's death. But the image had already been beamed into millions of living rooms across North America. Children watching their heroes play hockey suddenly saw a scene from a war zone. On the ice, the players recoiled. Terry Crisp, the coach of the St. Louis Blues, turned ashen. Players on both benches stood up, some turning away to vomit, others staring in paralyzed fascination. The referee, witnessing the carnage, waved frantically for the medical team, his face twisted in horror. But inside the center of the storm, Clint Malarchuk was awake. He was terrifyingly alert. When the artery was breached, his blood pressure began to plummet, but the adrenaline surge was so massive that it kept him conscious. He looked down at the ice and saw the pool widening beneath his knees. He saw the color. His goalie's mind, trained to analyze angles and speeds, instantly analyzed the wound. That's arterial, he thought. The voice in his head was calm, detached, and absolute. I'm dead. I have 3 minutes. He didn't panic. He didn't flail. The obsessive-compulsive disorder that had tormented him for years, the anxiety that made him tap goalposts, suddenly vanished. In the face of actual, undeniable death, the anxiety was replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism. He knew the anatomy. He knew that a severed carotid meant the brain would be starved of oxygen within minutes. He knew the heart would pump the body dry before the ambulance could even start its engine. And then, amidst the gore and the chaos, a single thought crystallized in his mind. It wasn't about his career. It wasn't about the pain. It was about his mother. He knew she was watching the game on television back in Western Canada. He imagined her sitting in her favorite chair, watching her son bleed out in high definition. The thought ripped through him more painfully than the skate blade. He could not let her see the light go out of his eyes. He could not let her witness his final convulsive moments on the cold ice. I have to get off, he told himself. I have to get to the locker room. I can't die out here like an animal. With a sheer force of will that defies medical explanation, Clint Malarchuk stood up. The strength required for that action defies medical explanation. His fuel line was cut. His system was depressurizing. Every time he moved, more blood sprayed from his neck. But he planted his skates. He pushed up. The trainer, Jim Pizzutelli, had sprinted onto the ice by now, reaching him within seconds. Pizzutelli grabbed a towel and pressed it against Clint's neck, but the blood soaked through it instantly, turning the white terry cloth red in a heartbeat. Clint leaned on the trainer, but he was skating under his own power. He moved toward the gate at the corner of the rink. The crowd watched in a stunned, reverent silence as the Cowboy goalie made his final stand. He wasn't waiting for a stretcher. He was walking to his own grave. As he skated, he felt the darkness closing in at the edges of his vision, the tunnel vision, the graying of the world. The sounds of the arena began to sound distant, like they were coming from underwater. He felt lightheaded, a strange, euphoric floating sensation that often precedes hemorrhagic shock. He reached the gate. He stepped off the ice. As soon as he crossed the threshold into the tunnel, out of sight of the cameras and the fans, his legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto a stretcher that was waiting there. The doors to the ice swung shut. The crowd was left staring at the empty net and the massive dark stain of blood that marked the spot where Clint Malarchuk had stood just moments before. The game was paused. The Zamboni would eventually have to come out to scrape the blood off the ice, mixing the red with the white shavings, erasing the evidence of the tragedy. But in the locker room, the battle was just beginning. Clint was still alive, but barely. He was now in the hands of Jim Pizzutelli, the former combat medic. The cameras were gone. The fans were gone. It was just a man, a wound, and the desperate, bloody fight to keep the soul inside the body. The eruption on the ice was over, but the war for survival had only just started. And as Clint lay there, feeling the cold hands of the trainer digging into his neck, he prepared himself to meet God. In the chaotic theater of a catastrophe, the difference between life and death often comes down to proximity. If Clint Malarchuk had been at the other end of the rink, his story would have ended there. But fate had placed him within 40 feet of Jim Pizzutelli. To the players, Pitts was simply the quiet man who taped ankles and massaged sore hamstrings. But long before he was wrapping the knees of millionaire athletes, Pizzutelli had been a combat engineer in the Vietnam War. The jungle had been a cruel but thorough teacher. There, he didn't deal with pulled groins or bruised egos. He dealt with the catastrophic results of high explosives on the human frame. He learned the grim arithmetic of triage: assess, stop the bleeding, and move on immediately. For 2 decades, that training had lain dormant, hidden beneath the routine of a civilian life. But on March 22, 1989, as he watched Clint Malarchuk clutch his throat and saw the arterial spray painting the ice, the soldier reemerged. While the other players froze in shock, paralyzed by the sheer volume of blood and the incomprehensible violence of the scene, Pizzutelli moved with the tactical urgency of a medic under fire. He didn't run like a hockey trainer. He sprinted across the ice with his shoes slipping slightly on the bloody surface. And when he reached Clint, he didn't look at his face but focused entirely on the wound. Most people, when confronted with a severe neck injury, hesitate because the neck is intimate and fragile, causing an instinctual recoil. But Pizzutelli saw the bright red spurts and immediately recognized the pathology of arterial compromise and imminent exsanguination. The roar of the crowd, the whistle of the referee, and the panic of the players all faded into white noise as his world narrowed down to the 6-inch gash in Clint's neck. He grabbed a thick towel as he ran, slamming it against the wound when he arrived, but a towel against a severed carotid artery is like trying to stop a fire hose with a napkin. The blood soaked through the white terry cloth instantly, warm and viscous, coating Pizzutelli's hands in the life force of the man he was trying to save. "Get him up," Pizzutelli barked, a command rather than a suggestion, as he wrapped his arm around Clint's waist and used his own body as a crutch. As they moved toward the exit gate, Pizzutelli was doing a rapid calculation, feeling the heat of the blood soaking into his own clothes and Clint's weight increasing with every step as the goalie's strength evaporated. He knew they couldn't wait for a stretcher on the ice because if they stopped moving, Clint would die right there in front of the cameras. The journey from the crease to the gate was less than 50 feet, but it was a death march where they moved as a single bloody organism, the dying man and the soldier. When they finally crossed the threshold of the Zamboni tunnel, out of the glare of the arena lights, the illusion of the game vanished completely, and they were no longer athlete and trainer, but casualty and medic. Pizzutelli yelled for the doctors, knowing they were seconds behind him, but seconds were a luxury they didn't have as he steered Clint toward the training room down a concrete hallway that was cold and sterile. The trail of blood they left behind was thick and continuous, a red line guiding the way to the trauma center. As they burst through the doors of the training room, Pete Sutelli shoved the equipment tables aside and hoisted Clint onto the plinth. The goalie was gray now, his eyes rolling back as the adrenaline that had allowed him to skate off the ice evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of hypovolemic shock. Jim Pizzutelli looked at the towel, which was saturated and useless against the blood that was still pumping and fighting against his grip. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen death win too many times, that external pressure wasn't enough because the artery was retracted and buried deep in the muscle. He had to do something that violated every rule of civilian first aid, something unimaginable to the average person. He had to go inside. The atmosphere in the Buffalo Sabres' locker room transformed instantly from a place of camaraderie to an abattoir. The air usually smelling of sweat and stick tape, now heavy with the metallic coppery scent of fresh iron that triggers a primal alarm in the human brain. Clint Malarchuk lay on the training table, his heavy goalie pads still strapped to his legs and his chest protector soaked crimson. Conscious, but drifting as he described the sensation as a peaceful, terrifying fading. The room was getting darker, and the voices around him sounded like they were coming from the end of a long tunnel, as if he were drowning in open air. Jim Pizzutelli stood over him, hands slick with blood making grip difficult, and stripped the towel away to reveal the wound laid bare, a gaping, yawning mouth in the side of Clint's neck where the severed muscles twitched and the jugular vein oozed. But deep inside the cut, the carotid artery continued its rhythmic, lethal work, pumping the remaining blood supply out into the open room. Pizzutelli didn't hesitate or ask for permission. He invoked the authority of the battlefield and took his thumb, stiffened it, and shoved it directly into the open wound. The visceral horror of that sensation was absolute. Having another man's finger penetrate the throat, pushing past the skin, past the torn sternocleidomastoid muscle, and diving deep into the wet, warm architecture of your own neck. Pizzutelli dug around blindly for a fraction of a second, his fingers searching for the source of the high-pressure jet until he felt the slick, rubbery tube of the carotid artery, which had retracted slightly like a snapped rubber band. He hooked his thumb over the vessel and pressed it hard against the transverse process of the cervical vertebrae, the spine itself, performing a maneuver of brute force and surgical precision known as the pinch. By compressing the artery against the bone, he mechanically shut off the flow of blood to the brain on the right side, instantly cutting off the geyser that had been spraying the ceiling. But this created a new, terrifying problem. By shutting off the carotid, he was stopping bleeding, but also stopping oxygen from reaching Clint's brain, necessitating a macabre dance where he would hold the artery shut until Clint's breathing stabilized, then release the pressure for a microsecond to let a burst of blood reach the brain, oscillating between life-saving hemostasis and potentially fatal stroke. Clint Malarchuk, lying on that table, looked up at the ceiling tiles and felt the immense pressure of Jim's thumb inside his throat and the crushing weight of the trainer's hand on his windpipe. He couldn't speak clearly as his mouth was full of blood that had bubbled up from the internal damage, causing him to choke and gasp for air. In this moment of absolute extremity, the human mind does strange things. Clint didn't scream or beg for his life, but went into a state of hyper-lucid shock. He looked at the team equipment manager, Rip Simonik, who was standing over him in tears and rasped, "Rip, get a priest." He wasn't asking for a doctor, but for last rites, a Catholic boy knowing he was dying and wanting to clear the slate. Then his thoughts drifted to his mother again, the image of her watching the TV screen haunting him more than his own death. He grabbed the team doctor's arm as the physician worked frantically to stabilize the IV line and whispered, "Doctor, put me to sleep. I don't want my mom to see me die." It is the most heartbreaking line in the history of sports, coming from a man literally being held together by a thumb in his neck. Yet the scene also had its moments of grotesque absurdity. As the shock deepened, Clint's brain began to misfire, and he started cracking gallows humor jokes, asking the paramedics loading him onto the gurney if they could stop for a beer on the way to the hospital, or asking for a cigarette, his brain making a last-ditch attempt to reject the reality of the situation. Pizzutelli never laughed, never smiled, and never moved. He climbed onto the gurney with Clint, his hand still buried inside the goalie's neck, and rode in the ambulance in an awkward, contorted position, kneeling over Clint's body to maintain the pinch as the vehicle swerved through Buffalo traffic. The ambulance ride was a nightmare of motion, where every bump in the road threatened to dislodge Pizzutelli's grip, which would cause the artery to retract further and Clint to be lost. Pizzutelli's arm began to cramp, and his muscles burned with lactic acid, but he didn't let go. He stared at the wound, watching for the slightest leak like a guardian angel with blood under his fingernails. When they arrived at Buffalo General Hospital, the trauma team was waiting in the bay, alerted to a traumatic neck injury with massive blood loss. They wheeled Clint into the trauma room, where the lights were blindingly bright, and surgeons in sterile gowns swarmed the gurney. Even then, they couldn't just take over. Pizzutelli couldn't let go until the surgeons were literally ready to clamp the artery with hemostats. There was a surreal moment of handover where the surgeon looked at the athletic trainer, this man in a blood-soaked tracksuit, and nodded. On the count of 3, Pizzutelli removed his thumb, and the surgeon instantly clamped the vessel. Only then did Jim Pizzutelli step back, looking at his hands stained a deep dark red with blood drying into the creases of his skin, and began to shake as the adrenaline dump hit him after 20 minutes of physically holding a man's soul inside his body. On the operating table, Clint Malarchuk was fading, with critically low blood pressure, as they pumped fluids into him and prepared for surgery. The damage was extensive. The skate had missed the internal jugular vein, but severed the external one, sliced the carotid sheath, and cut through the levator scapulae muscle. The surgery took hours as the doctors worked with microscopic precision to reattach the plumbing of his neck, suturing the artery wall, a delicate procedure where one wrong stitch could cause a stroke, reconnecting the muscles so he could turn his head again, and finally closing the skin. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 10, 100. By the time they were finished, there were over 300 stitches holding Clint Malarchuk's head to his shoulders. He looked like a Frankenstein creation with a jagged, angry line running from his jaw to his collarbone, a zipper of black thread on pale, waxen skin. He was alive, a medical miracle, but he was also a man who had felt the finger of death inside his own throat, looked into the void, asked for a priest, and prepared to die. And now he had to do something even harder. He had to live. The doctors congratulated themselves, and the media prepared their headlines about the heroic survival. But in the quiet of the hospital room, as the anesthesia wore off and the pain set in, the real horror was just beginning to stir. The body was closed, but the mind had been ripped open, and there are no stitches for the soul. When Clint Malarchuk woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the hospital window, indifferent to the carnage of the night before. He was alive, a fact that seemed to violate the laws of probability, but his body felt foreign, a heavy casing of lead and pain. He raised a hand to his throat and felt the thick, restrictive band of gauze, and beneath it, the ridge of 300 stitches that now held his head to his shoulders. He was no longer just a goaltender. He was a medical marvel, a Frankenstein creation stitched together by the steady hands of surgeons who had worked through the night to repair the plumbing of his neck. The doctors told him he was lucky, a word that felt hollow as the anesthesia wore off and the throbbing, searing pain of the incision set in, a constant reminder of how close the blade had come to turning him into a memory. But the real pathology of the next 10 days was not happening in the tissue of his neck. It was happening in the architecture of his mind. In the world of professional sports, particularly in the rugged blood and guts culture of 1980s, hockey, injury is viewed not as a trauma to be processed, but as an obstacle to be ignored. Almost immediately, the machinery of denial began to whir into motion. The media descended upon the hospital, hungry for the hero narrative, desperate to paint Clint as the unkillable cowboy who had stared down the Reaper. They didn't ask about the nightmares that were already beginning to loop behind his eyes. They asked when he would play again. And Clint, terrified of the silence that would come if he stopped moving, gave them the answer they wanted to hear. The doctors advised caution, suggesting he take the rest of the season off, perhaps even retire to let the psychological wounds heal alongside the physical ones. They warned him about the fragility of the arterial repair, the risk of blood clots, and the sheer trauma his system had endured. But Clint Malarchuk wasn't listening to medical advice. He was listening to the roaring anxiety of his obsessive-compulsive disorder. To stop playing would mean sitting alone in a room with the memory of the blood. It would mean acknowledging that he had almost died, and that thought was a black hole he refused to look into. So he constructed a lie, a magnificent, towering edifice of false bravado. He told everyone he was fine. He told the press he was ready. He told himself that getting back on the ice was the only cure. It takes 6 weeks for a broken bone to knit. It takes months to recover from a torn ligament. Clint Malarchuk decided he would return to the National Hockey League in 10 days. It was a decision born not of courage, but of a desperate, frantic need to outrun his own shadow. He left the hospital against the quiet judgment of the medical staff, returning to a home that felt different now, haunted by the fragility of his own existence. He couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the skate blade. When he looked in the mirror to shave, he had to navigate around the jagged, angry zipper of flesh that ran from his ear to his collarbone, a daily confrontation with his mortality. Yet, he forced a smile, put on his cowboy hat, and marched back toward the arena, a soldier returning to the trench because the trench was the only place he understood. April 2nd, 1989, Buffalo Memorial Auditorium. The stage was set for one of the most emotional nights in the history of sports, but underneath the fanfare, a grim psychological tragedy was unfolding. The Buffalo Sabres were playing the Quebec Nordiques, Clint's former team. The arena was packed to the rafters, the air electric with a morbid curiosity and a genuine, overwhelming love for the man who had nearly died on that very ice just a week and a half prior. As the lights dimmed and the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, introducing the starting lineup, the name Clint Malarchuk acted as a detonator. 16,000 people rose to their feet as one. The ovation was deafening, a physical wall of sound that shook the dust from the rafters of the old auditorium. They cheered for 5 minutes straight. They were cheering for life. They were cheering for the miracle. But down on the ice, skating toward the goal crease that had been a pool of his own blood just days before, Clint Malarchuk felt like an imposter. He wasn't the hero they were clapping for. He was a terrified man hiding inside a goalie mask. He could feel the stitches pulling tight against his skin with every turn of his head. He could feel the phantom pressure of Jim Pizzutelli's thumb in his neck. He stepped into the crease. The ice had been scraped and resurfaced, the red stain erased, but to Clint's eyes, the blood was still there, ghost images painted on the white canvas. The game began, and the nightmare shifted from memory to reality. Every time a player skated near him, every time a scramble formed in front of the net, Clint flinched. The sharp steel blades of the skates, once just tools of the trade, now looked like knives flashing in the arena lights. He was playing in a state of hypervigilance, his brain screaming at him to run, to get off the ice, to protect his neck. But the Cowboy took over. The dissociation that he had perfected since childhood kicked in. He went into a fugue state, his body performing the saves on autopilot while his mind floated somewhere above the rafters, detached and numb. He stopped pucks. He made glove saves. He played brilliantly, tragically well. The crowd roared with every stop, fueling the delusion that he was healed. "See," the narrative whispered, "he's back. Nothing can kill him." Midway through the game, there was a scramble. A skate came up high near his face. Clint recoiled violently, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The panic attack was right there, clawing at his throat, but he swallowed it down. He pushed it into the dark basement of his mind where he kept the OCD demons and the fear of failure. He finished the game. The Sabres lost, but Clint had won the war of perception. He stripped off his gear in the locker room, the same room where he had received his last rites, and accepted the pats on the back and the welcome home speeches. Everyone saw a triumph. Nobody saw the disaster. By returning so soon, by refusing to process the trauma, Clint Malarchuk had sealed the cracks in his psyche with duct tape and pretended the foundation was sound. He had proven to the world that he was tough, but in doing so, he had denied himself the right to be broken. The ovation died down. The fans went home, but the adrenaline that had carried him through the game eventually faded, leaving him alone in the quiet of the night with a brain that was now fully convinced that the ice rink was a killing floor. He had survived the blade, and now he had survived the return. But the bill for this emotional suppression was coming due, and it would be paid in nightmares, in vodka, and eventually in lead. The hero was back, but the man was slowly beginning to die. When the hockey season finally ended in the spring of 1989, the noise stopped. The cheering crowds dispersed. The arena lights were turned off, and Clint Malarchuk was left alone with the one thing he had been running from, his own mind. In the high-stakes environment of the playoffs, adrenaline had acted as a powerful anesthetic, masking the psychological rot that was taking hold beneath his scar. But in the quiet vacuum of the off-season, without the distraction of flying pucks or the structure of game days, the demons that had been waiting in the shadows stepped into the light. The hero who had waved to the fans was gone. In his place was a man rapidly disintegrating into a state of nervous ruin. The nights were the worst. Sleep, once a refuge for the exhausted athlete, became a torture chamber. The human brain, when traumatized, often gets stuck on a loop, a phenomenon known as re-experiencing. Clint's mind had recorded the 22 seconds of the accident in high-definition horror, and now it played that tape on repeat, projecting it onto the back of his eyelids every time he tried to rest. He would drift off, only to be jerked awake by the sensation of cold steel against his neck. In his dreams, the skate blade was enormous, the size of a scythe. In his dreams, the ice didn't just get stained, it turned into an ocean of blood that swallowed him whole. He would wake up screaming, his sheets soaked in sweat, his hand clutching his throat to make sure it was still closed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the onset of severe, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1989, that term was reserved for Vietnam veterans, not hockey players. There was no vocabulary for what Clint was feeling. He didn't know why he felt a sudden, crushing panic in the grocery store when he heard a sudden noise. He didn't know why the smell of iron or raw meat made him nauseous. He just knew that he was weak. And in the code of the cowboy, weakness was a sin. So he did what many men of his generation did. He self-medicated. The obsessive-compulsive disorder that had always plagued him ramped up its demands, convincing him that if he didn't check the locks 10 times, or if he didn't organize his cans of soda in perfect alignment, the blade would come back. To silence the screaming voice in his head, Clint turned to chemistry. Alcohol ceased to be a social lubricant and became a medicinal necessity. He discovered that if he drank enough vodka, the film projector in his mind would finally jam. The nightmares would dissolve into a black, dreamless void. He began to carry a duffel bag not filled with gym gear, but with bottles. He hid them in the garage, in the bathroom, under the car seat. He was building a fortress of glass bottles to protect himself from the memories. But alcohol is a depressant, and for a brain already drowning in trauma, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The tough guy was slowly being hollowed out, leaving behind a shell that looked like Clint Malarchuk, but felt nothing but terror and rage. As the summer dragged on, the anxiety mutated. The mind, desperate to make sense of a senseless tragedy, often engages in a defense mechanism called displacement. Clint could not fight the skate blade. It was an inanimate object, a phantom of the past. He could not fight the memory. It was intangible. So his psyche began to search for a physical enemy, a monster he could touch, fight, and kill. He needed a proxy for the thing that had tried to eat him. He found it in the ocean. Clint developed a sudden manic obsession with sharks. It makes a twisted sort of psychological sense. The shark is nature's perfect killing machine, silent, predatory, armed with rows of razor-sharp teeth that shear flesh just like the blade that had opened his neck. The shark represents sudden, violent death rising from the deep. Clint began to travel to Florida, not to relax on the beaches, but to hunt. He wasn't fishing for sport. He was fishing for revenge. He would charter boats and spend days on the water, baking under the sun, drinking heavily, waiting for a fin to break the surface. This wasn't the leisure of a retiree. This was a war. When he hooked a shark, the battle became personal. He would fight the creature for hours, straining against the rod until his muscles screamed, his face contorted in a mask of fury. When he finally brought the animal alongside the boat, he wasn't satisfied with just releasing it or taking a photo. He wanted to see it dead. He wanted to dominate the thing that represented his trauma. There is a disturbing symmetry to these expeditions. Here was a man who had nearly bled to death, now standing on the deck of a boat, surrounded by chum and fish blood, acting as the executioner. He was trying to reverse the roles. On the ice in Buffalo, he had been the prey, helpless and exposed. On the boat in Florida, he was the predator. He was the one holding the knife. He was the one deciding who lived and who died. He would stare into the dead black eyes of a shark and feel a fleeting moment of control, a temporary victory over the reaper. But displacement is a failed therapy. You can kill 1,000 sharks, but you cannot kill a memory. The relief was always temporary. As soon as the boat docked and the adrenaline faded, the silence returned. The shark was dead, but the scar on his neck was still there. The emptiness inside him was vast and consuming. These trips to Florida were not healing him. They were exhausting him. They were evidence of a mind that was frantically flailing, trying to grab onto anything solid in a world that had become fluid and terrifying. His friends and family saw the behavior, the heavy drinking, the erratic mood swings, the bizarre obsession with hunting, but they didn't know how to intervene, How do you tell a national hero that he's acting like a madman? How do you tell a survivor that he hasn't actually survived? Clint was a master of disguise, hiding his disintegration behind the cowboy persona. He would laugh loud, buy the rounds at the bar, and tell stories about the big catch, all while his soul was rotting from the inside out. He was fighting a war on two fronts: the external battle against the Sharks and the internal civil war against his own chemistry. And he was losing both. The fall was coming, and it would be far harder than the ice. When the lights of the arena finally dim for the last time, and a professional athlete hangs up his skates, he loses more than just a paycheck. He loses his identity. For Clint Malarchuk, retirement wasn't a graceful exit into the sunset. It was a plummet into a void. Without the rigid structure of the NHL schedule, the morning skates, the team meals, the adrenaline of game time, the guardrails of his life vanished. He was no longer the cowboy goalie, the warrior who defied death. He was just Clint, a man in his 30s with a scar on his neck, a bullet in his subconscious, and a silence in his house that was becoming deafening. To fill that silence and to numb the electrical storm of anxiety that still raged in his brain, he declared war on his own biology. The 1990s became a blurred era of chemical warfare. Alcohol had been his primary anesthetic, but as his tolerance grew, the vodka stopped working as effectively. It could no longer knock him out. It just made him angry. So he opened the medicine cabinet. He began to mix a lethal cocktail of prescription drugs, painkillers for the lingering aches of a hockey career, sedatives for the insomnia, and tranquilizers for the panic attacks. He wasn't taking these pills to get high. He was taking them to reach a baseline of numbness, a state of zero where the terrifying movie in his head would pause. He became a chemist of his own destruction, learning exactly how many pills washed down with how much beer would grant him 4 hours of dreamless oblivion. The physical toll of this toxicity was grotesque. His body, once a high-performance machine capable of reflex speeds that baffled scientists, began to revolt. The chronic stress of untreated PTSD caused his stomach to turn on itself. He developed ulcers that gnawed at his lining, a visceral burning mirror to the pain in his mind. He would often wake up vomiting bile and blood, his digestive system eroded by the acid of anxiety and alcohol. Yet, the obsessive-compulsive disorder remained the cruelest taskmaster. Even in his intoxicated stupor, he was a slave to the rituals. He would check the locks until his fingers bled. He would clean invisible spots on the counter until the laminate wore down. He was trapped in a cycle of terrifying repetition, a prisoner in a house that he had turned into a bunker. This was the slow rot, the necrosis of the soul. It lacked the spectacular gore of the throat-slashing incident, but it was far more lethal. The skate blade had attacked him from the outside, a clean, sharp cut that surgeons could stitch. The chemical dependency was an internal parasite, eating the host from the inside out. Friends and former teammates would see him at events, looking bloated, his eyes glassy and vacant, and they would whisper. They saw the shell of the legend, but the man inside was screaming behind a pane of thick, distorted glass, unable to break through. He was dying by degrees, drowning in a sea of pills and 80-proof liquor, waiting for the day when his heart would finally give up the ghost. In an attempt to regain some semblance of control, Clint turned to coaching. He stood behind the benches of minor league teams and eventually returned to the NHL as a goaltending coach. On the surface, it seemed like a redemption arc, the veteran passing on his wisdom to the next generation. He wore the suit. He held the clipboard. He stood stoically behind the glass, analyzing angles and techniques. But this was the ultimate masquerade. The suit was a costume, The clipboard was a prop. The man wearing them was a high-functioning ruin, holding himself together with duct tape and denial for the 3 hours of a game, only to collapse the moment he reached the privacy of his hotel room. Coaching, it turned out, was a torture unique from playing. As a player, you can burn off the adrenaline. You can physically impact the outcome. As a coach, you are helpless. You stand and watch. The lack of physical release turned his anxiety into a pressurized bomb. His temper became legendary and terrifying. He would explode in locker rooms, punching walls, screaming until the veins in his neck, the very neck that had been sewn back together, bulged dangerously. This wasn't passion. It was the fight response of a brain stuck in permanent survival mode, perceiving every loss, every bad goal as a life or death threat. It was during these volatile years that the collateral damage of his trauma began to spread to the people he loved. He met Joni, the woman who would become his fourth wife. She fell in love with the charismatic, funny, rugged cowboy she met during the day. She didn't know she was also marrying a werewolf. The metaphor is apt because Clint effectively changed when the sun went down. The night terrors returned with a vengeance. He wouldn't just wake up screaming. He would wake up fighting. He would thrash in the bed, punching and kicking at invisible attackers, reliving the trauma of the ice or some imagined horror from the deep. Joni learned to sleep lightly, terrified that the man she loved might accidentally hurt her in his sleep as he fought off the ghosts in his head. The isolation of this existence is hard to overstate. To the public, he was a survivor, a symbol of toughness. To his players, he was an intense, demanding mentor. But at home, behind drawn curtains, he was a frightened child hiding in a man's body, weeping into his hands, begging for the noise in his head to stop. He was living a double life, maintaining the facade of the indestructible cowboy goalie while secretly researching suicide methods. He felt like a fraud, a con artist selling a story of survival while actively planning his own exit. The pressure of maintaining the lie was becoming heavier than the guilt of leaving. He was a walking ghost haunting his own life, and the bullet that would eventually find its way into his skull was already being cast in the foundry of his despair. The inevitable collision was coming, and this time there would be no trainer to pinch the artery, no team of surgeons to stitch him up. He was heading for a cliff, and he had cut the brake lines himself. By the autumn of 2008, the slow downward spiral of Clint Malarchuk's life had accelerated into a freefall. In physics, terminal velocity is the speed at which an object falling through the atmosphere ceases to accelerate, because the resistance of the air equals the pull of gravity. For Clint, the resistance was gone. The pills, the alcohol, the coaching job, the tough guy persona, none of it was slowing him down anymore. He was plummeting toward the earth, and the ground was rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. He had taken a leave of absence from his coaching job with the Columbus Blue Jackets. To the outside world, it was for personal reasons, a vague euphemism often used to cover a multitude of sins. In reality, he had been sent home because he was unraveling. He was no longer just volatile, he was incoherent. He retreated to his ranch in Gardnerville, Nevada, a place of stark, rugged beauty that should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became his prison. The wide-open spaces of the high desert didn't offer freedom. They just offered fewer witnesses to his collapse. The depression he experienced in these final weeks was not a feeling of sadness. Sadness is a human emotion. It has a cause and an end. What Clint felt was a total suffocating absence of hope. It was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making every breath a conscious, exhausting effort. The black dog, as Winston Churchill famously called it, had not just visited Clint. It had moved in, laid down at the foot of his bed, and growled every time he tried to move. His brain, tortured by 19 years of untreated trauma, had begun to lie to him. This is the most dangerous symptom of severe mental illness: the distorted narrative. The voice in his head, which sounded exactly like his own, told him that he was a burden. It told him that his wife, Joni, would be better off without him. It told him that his children would be relieved. It whispered that the world was a painful, jagged place and that he had overstayed his welcome. Suicide in this state does not look like a tragedy. It looks like a solution. It looks like mercy. He wasn't craving death. He was craving silence. He just wanted the projector in his mind to stop playing the film of the blood on the ice. He wanted the noise to stop. The days leading up to October 7th, 2008, are a blur of ethanol and madness. Clint entered what alcoholics call the spin cycle. He wasn't drinking to get drunk anymore. He was drinking to maintain a baseline of functioning that was rapidly disintegrating. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. The insomnia was absolute. For days, he wandered the grounds of his ranch like a ghost, a rifle in one hand and a bottle in the other, muttering to himself, arguing with demons that only he could see. His wife, Joni, watched this transformation with a helpless, paralyzed terror. She tried to intervene, tried to take the bottles away, but trying to reason with a man in the grip of manic psychosis is like trying to reason with a hurricane. Clint was paranoid, agitated, and deeply unpredictable. The man she loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with dead eyes and a hair-trigger temper. She was living in a house with a bomb that had already started ticking. On the morning of Tuesday, October 7th, 2008, the atmosphere at the ranch was heavy. Clint had been awake for days, his chemistry shattered, alcohol warring with prescription drugs. The black dog of depression had moved in. He wasn't craving death, he was craving silence. He just wanted the projector in his mind to stop playing the film of the blood on the ice. The terrifying reality of suicide is that it is often not a frantic, chaotic event, but a moment of eerie, calculated stillness. On the afternoon of October 7th, 2008, the world around Clint Malarchuk seemed to hold its breath. The Nevada sun was high and bright, casting sharp shadows across the dusty ground of his ranch. To a casual observer, the scene might have looked peaceful, a man sitting on a bench near his barn, taking a break from the day's work. But closer inspection would have revealed the trembling in his hands and the vacant, 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. He was sitting on the edge of the abyss, dangling his feet over the side, waiting for gravity to do the rest. His wife, Joni, had sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She had been walking on eggshells for days, living in the blast radius of his unraveling. But this afternoon felt different. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, robotic detachment. She walked out to the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found him sitting there with the .22 caliber rifle. It was a varmint gun, a tool used for shooting gophers or rabbits, but in Clint's hands it looked heavy and ominous. When she asked him what he was doing, her voice trembling, Clint looked up. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply said, "I'm waiting for a rabbit." It was a lie so transparent it was heartbreaking. There was no rabbit. The only thing he was hunting was the silence. But even at the very end, Clint Malarchuk needed to maintain the facade of the cowboy. He couldn't admit he was broken. He had to pretend he was working. He had to frame his own destruction as a chore, a necessary task to be completed. Joni didn't believe him, but she was paralyzed by the surreal horror of the moment. She turned to go back to the house, perhaps to call for help, perhaps simply unable to watch the man she loved disintegrate any further. As she turned, Clint made his move. It wasn't a decision. It was a surrender. The chemicals in his brain, twisted by alcohol and exhaustion, had convinced him that this was the only logical conclusion to the story that began in Buffalo. He placed the butt of the rifle on the dirt between his boots. He leaned forward, bowing his head as if in prayer. He placed the cold, circular steel of the barrel firmly against the soft tissue under his chin, right behind the jawbone. In that final millisecond, we can only speculate what went through his mind. Did he see the ice? Did he see his mother? Or did he simply see the darkness he so desperately craved? He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He pulled the trigger. The sound was a sharp, cracking pop like a dry branch snapping, echoing flatly across the desert. It was a small sound for such a catastrophic act, but it signaled the end of the man Clint Malarchuk used to be. The bullet left the chamber, traveling at over 1,000 feet per second, on a direct course for the center of his brain. When a bullet enters the human body, it creates a phenomenon known as a permanent cavity, a tunnel of destroyed tissue that marks its path. But a bullet fired into the skull is a different beast entirely. It is physics clashing with the most complex architecture in the known universe. The reason Clint Malarchuk is alive today lies in the physics of the bullet's trajectory, which must be examined with forensic precision. The bullet entered through the submental space, the soft area underneath the chin. Because the rifle was pressed tight against the skin, the muzzle gases had nowhere to go, expanding instantly into the wound and causing massive internal trauma before the bullet even struck bone. The projectile tore through the floor of his mouth, shredding the geniohyoid and mylohyoid muscles, the machinery of swallowing and speech. It smashed into the tongue, effectively obliterating the center of the organ, turning it into pulp. Continuing upward, the lead slug encountered the hard palate, the roof of the mouth. This is a plate of bone that separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. The bullet punched through it with violent force, shattering the bone into razor-sharp shards. These fragments of his own skeleton became secondary projectiles, spraying into his sinuses like shrapnel from a grenade. The bullet was now tumbling, its shape deformed by the impact, losing velocity but gaining destructive surface area. It crossed the nasal cavity and headed straight for the sphenoid bone. This is the final barrier. Behind the sphenoid bone lies the brainstem and the base of the brain itself, the control center for heart rate, breathing, and consciousness. If the bullet breached this wall, Clint would be dead before his body hit the ground. It would be lights out, a total cessation of existence. But here, the laws of probability bent. Perhaps the bullet had lost just enough energy passing through the jaw and the palate. Perhaps the angle was a fraction of a degree off. Or perhaps the bone at the base of Clint's skull was simply harder than the lead. Upon impact with the sphenoid, the bullet did not penetrate. It mushroomed. It flattened out against the bone like a coin placed on a train track coming to a dead stop. The tip of the bullet rested exactly 3 millimeters from the brain tissue. 3 millimeters. That is the thickness of 2 dimes. That is the distance between a funeral and a hospital stay. Clint did not lose consciousness. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a high-pitched ringing that instantly drowned out the world. He felt a massive, concussive blow to his face as if he had been kicked by a horse. And then for the second time in his life came the taste. Copper, iron, salt. His mouth filled instantly with blood. He sat up. He was not dead. He was not in the dark room he had sought. He was still sitting on the bench in Nevada, the sun still shining, the gun lying in the dirt at his feet. Smoke drifted from the barrel. He leaned forward and spat, expelling teeth, bone fragments, and a torrent of blood onto the dusty ground. He looked at the red pool forming in the dirt, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. I failed. He had tried to unzip his existence, and the zipper had jammed. The horror of this moment was arguably worse than the suicide attempt itself. He was now trapped in a mangled body, fully awake, fully aware that he had just tried to kill himself in front of his wife and that he would have to live with the consequences. Joni, who had turned at the sound of the shot, was screaming, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Clint looked at her, blood pouring from his mouth and nose, his face rapidly swelling into a grotesque mask, and he felt a shame so deep it burned hotter than the wound. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a cowboy. He was a man who couldn't even die right. The ambulance was called, the siren began to wail in the distance, and the man who couldn't die prepared for his second trip to the trauma unit, carrying a bullet in his head that would stay there forever. The journey to the hospital was a blur of siren noise, pain, and a terrifying sense of déjà vu. 19 years earlier, Clint had ridden in the back of an ambulance in Buffalo, holding his own throat closed, cracking jokes to keep the fear at bay. This time, there were no jokes. His jaw was shattered, his tongue was useless, and his mouth was wired shut by swelling and blood. He lay strapped to the gurney, staring up at the roof of the ambulance, trapped in a silent prison of his own making. The paramedics worked with frantic urgency, their faces tight with the specific horror of treating a gunshot wound to the face, but Clint felt a strange, detached calm. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore. He was afraid of living. At renowned regional medical center in Reno, the trauma team went to work. They sedated him heavily, inducing a coma to prevent him from thrashing and causing further damage to his compromised airway. For days, Clint floated in a dark chemical void, suspended between life and death. While he slept, surgeons worked to reconstruct the ruin of his face. They fished bone fragments out of his sinuses. They wired his jaw back together. They stitched up the entry wound under his chin. But when it came to the bullet, the .22 caliber slug lodged at the base of his skull, they paused. The neurosurgeons gathered around the X-ray light boxes, staring at the ghostly white starburst in the center of Clint's head. To remove it would require a craniotomy. They would have to saw through the skull, navigate past delicate brain tissue, and dig the metal out of the bone. The risk of infection, brain bleed, or permanent neurological damage was too high. The bullet, they decided, had done its damage, but it was now inert. It was safer to leave it where it was. When Clint finally woke up, dragged back to consciousness by the nurses, he was a different man. He was a patchwork creation. He couldn't speak. He couldn't eat solid food. His face was swollen and bruised, unrecognizable in the mirror. He reached up and felt the bandages, tracing the lines of the new trauma. He now had 2 sets of scars, the horizontal line on his neck from the skate blade and the vertical hole under his chin from the bullet. They formed an inverted cross, a geometric map of his suffering. He was a Frankenstein monster pieced together by surgeons and luck, animated not by electricity, but by a stubborn refusal of his body to quit. But the physical pain of the recovery, the liquid diet, the wired jaw, the constant throbbing in his head, was nothing compared to the shame. He had to look into the eyes of his wife, Joni, and see the trauma he had inflicted on her. He had to face his children. He lay in that hospital bed, a prisoner of his own survival, realizing that the bullet in his head was now a permanent passenger. He would carry the instrument of his suicide attempt with him for the rest of his life, a heavy metallic reminder of the moment he tried to check out. In the traditional hero's journey, the survivor of a near-death experience returns home to applause and a newfound appreciation for life. But Clint Malarchuk's story is a gothic horror, not a fairy tale. When he was physically stable enough to be discharged, he wasn't sent home to his ranch. He was sent to a psychiatric facility. For the first time in his 47 years, the Cowboy Goalie was stripped of his armor. There were no pads, no mask, no cowboy hat, no bottle of vodka to hide behind. There was just a man in a hospital gown, broken into 1,000 pieces, locked in a ward with strangers. The doors locked from the outside, the windows were reinforced. It was an asylum, a place designed for those whose minds had become dangerous to themselves. Clint hated it. He raged against it. His tough guy programming revolted at the idea of being in a nut house. He paced the halls, angry and humiliated, plotting his escape. But there was nowhere to go. The silence he had been running from for 2 decades had finally caught him. He was forced to sit in group therapy, surrounded by people battling schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression. He looked at them and saw crazy people. Then he looked in the mirror and saw a man with a bullet in his head and a scar on his neck, and he realized he was the craziest one in the room. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't a moment of divine inspiration. It was a moment of exhaustion. He was simply too tired to keep lying. He sat down with a psychiatrist, a woman who didn't care about his save percentage or his legendary toughness. She looked at the x-rays. She looked at the history. And she gave him the diagnosis that would save his life. Clint, she said, you have severe chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. You have obsessive compulsive disorder, and you are an alcoholic. Hearing the words out loud was like having a heavy pack cut from his shoulders. For years, he thought he was weak. He thought he was defective. Now he realized he was sick. There is a profound difference. Weakness is a character flaw. Sickness is a biological reality. The bullet, the alcohol, the rage, they were all symptoms of a disease that had started on the ice in Buffalo and festered in the darkness for 19 years. For 6 months, Clint lived in the facility. He went through the agonizing process of detox. He learned to talk about the blood without dissociating. He learned to cry. It was a brutal, ugly excavation of the soul. He had to vomit up the trauma, piece by piece. He had to forgive the boy who was afraid of the cold in Alberta. He had to forgive the goalie who let the skate blade in. And hardest of all, he had to forgive the man who pulled the trigger in the Nevada desert. He wasn't cured. You don't cure a bullet in the brain, but he was awake. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight the real enemy. Not with fists or sharks, but with the truth. There is a concept in medicine known as foreign body retention, a clinical term usually reserved for shrapnel in soldiers or splinters in carpenters. But in the case of Clint Malarchuk, it refers to a piece of lead, deformed and flattened, that sits deep within the bone architecture of his skull. It is still there today. If you were to take an x-ray of his head right now, amidst the gray ghostly shapes of the sinus cavities and the brain tissue, you would see it, a stark, bright white starburst. It is a permanent tenet, a piece of heavy metal that pays no rent but demands a heavy toll. Living with a bullet in your head is not just a medical curiosity, it is a psychological horror story that plays out every single day. The doctors at renowned regional medical center made the calculated decision to leave it there, determining that the trauma of digging it out, drilling through the skull, navigating past the temporal lobe, risking a brain bleed was more dangerous than letting it stay. So the body did what bodies do. It calcified. Bone grew around the intruder, encasing the lead in a calcium tomb. The skin under his chin healed over the entry wound, leaving a small puckered scar that looks like a second belly button. But the bullet is not silent. It is a physical artifact of his own self-destruction, a constant nagging reminder of the Tuesday afternoon when he tried to check out of existence. Clint describes it as a presence. When the barometric pressure changes, when a storm rolls in over the Nevada desert, he can feel it. A dull, heavy ache deep behind his eyes. It is as if the bullet is vibrating, resonating with the atmosphere, reminding him, "I'm still here. You missed, but I didn't leave." The mental toll of carrying one's own murder weapon inside the body is agonizing. Every time he has a headache, a flash of panic sets in. Is the bullet moving? Is the lead leaching into his bloodstream, poisoning his thoughts? Is it pressing against a nerve that will one day turn off the lights for good? He walks through airport security scanners and wonders if he will set off the alarms, if he will have to explain to a stranger that he is carrying a .22 caliber slug in his head because he couldn't stand the noise in his mind. He is a walking paradox, a man who was saved by the very object that was meant to kill him. The bullet stopped millimeters from the brainstem, sparing his life, but in doing so, it imprisoned him with the memory. He carries his death with him 24 hours a day, a heavy metallic secret that sits right behind his smile. When Clint was finally released from the psychiatric facility, he faced a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. He was sober, he was medicated, he was diagnosed, but he was also carrying a secret that was eating him alive. The world still saw him as the Cowboy Goalie, the tough-as-nails survivor of the throat slash. They didn't know about the bullet. They didn't know about the asylum. They didn't know that the accident with the gun was actually a suicide attempt. The shame of that secret was a toxic sludge in his gut, threatening to pull him back into the darkness. He realized that to truly live, he had to destroy the myth of Clint Malarchuk. He had to kill the cowboy so the man could survive. He decided to write a book. It wasn't going to be a typical sports autobiography filled with locker room pranks and tales of glory. It was going to be a confession. He sat down with a co-author, Dan Robson, and began the brutal, agonizing process of an emotional autopsy. He had to revisit the ice in Buffalo. He had to smell the blood again. He had to walk back into the barn in Nevada and put the gun under his chin. Writing A Matter of Inches was not a creative endeavor. It was an exorcism. It was a violent purging of the trauma. He vomited his pain onto the pages, sparing no detail, hiding no weakness. He detailed the crying, the shaking, the pills, the rage, and the overwhelming desire to die. When the book was published in 2014, Clint was terrified. In the hyper-masculine culture of professional hockey, talking about feelings was taboo. Admitting you wanted to kill yourself was seen as a betrayal of the code. He expected rejection. He expected to be ostracized. But when he started his book tour, standing on stages in front of strangers, something miraculous happened. He looked out into the crowd and saw big, tough men, construction workers, police officers, hockey players, weeping. He wasn't just telling his story, he was telling theirs. By ripping open his own chest and showing the world his broken heart, he gave permission for others to do the same. He realized that his purpose on this earth wasn't to stop pucks. It wasn't to be a cowboy. His purpose was to be the guy who survived so he could go back into the darkness and pull others out. The bullet in his head became a badge of honor, a symbol not of failure, but of resilience. He had cheated death twice, not because he was lucky, but because he had work to do. The exorcism was complete. The demons were still there, but they no longer owned the house. Clint Malarchuk had finally taken the keys back. History is often written in ink, but safety regulations are written in blood. Following the horrific spectacle of 1989, the NHL was forced to confront the vulnerability of its gladiators. Before Clint, the neck was naked. After Clint, the neck guard became standard armor. Every time you see a modern goalie strap on that Kevlar collar, you are looking at the ghost of Clint Malarchuk. But his true legacy isn't made of Kevlar. It is made of scars. For decades, sports culture was a monolith of toxic silence. If you were hurt, you hid it. If you were scared, you drank it away. Clint took a sledgehammer to that wall. By confessing his suicide attempt and exposing the bullet in his skull, he became the face of a new kind of toughness, the courage to scream for help. Is he the luckiest man alive or the most cursed? He is a walking statistical anomaly, a ship of Theseus made of flesh and bone, held together by luck and physics. If you met him today, you'd see a smiling, retired cowboy. But look closer. Look at the thin white line across his throat. Look at the scar under his chin. And visualize the lead bullet still sitting deep in his skull. A heavy, silent passenger that will go with him to the grave. Clint Malarchuk looked the Reaper in the face twice, and twice the Reaper blinked. But rest assured, death never forgets a face. It just waits.